Hey everybody, I wanted to quickly post up a video going over the patch notes for Elder Scrolls Legends. So I'm going to quickly go through some of the changes that have been made to the game and kind of give my 2 cents on it and whether or not some of the balance changes they made were good or not, so on and so forth. So I'll just go in order of the patch notes and then cover the balance changes when we get to them. So the first big thing that they added is there's now a deck sharing function. So you can now have a code and you can copy pasta that code and download decks. It's a much easier way of transferring deck lists and going from a site like Legends Decks and just copying the code from there and popping that deck up right into your versions of Elder Scrolls Legends. Uh, it's kind of a hotly wanted feature, so I'm glad we're finally getting it. They added a handful of other things in case you don't have the cards in it. The cards are kind of still there. They're calling it ghosted, but you can then craft them and they'll be right in the list, or you can take the ghosted card out and replace it with something else that's a similar card that you actually own. Okay, so next to balance changes, I'm gonna spend probably a bulk of the time going over some of these balance. Well, let's not go to the balance changes yet. Let's cover some of the other quick changes that were made that I noted were important. One big, I think it's under general now. Yes, here's one pretty significant change. Disconnected players now auto concede after 3 turns. I've had an issue with this a few times where people disconnected or they rage quit out on me, and I'm in a position where I can attack to kill them, but they'd be drawing cards. It takes me multiple turns to kill them. So I end up sitting there doing nothing while my opponent isn't even there because should they come back, I die. So this is a pretty good change. So I don't get in those situations where I'm basically just playing against nobody because I don't want to die. The other significant changes was the rewards. I don't know if you noticed, but the daily login screen has changed. It's now much easier to get that legendary reward. I had to complain about that a lot because I would often miss one day and not get the legendary, and it's pretty sad face when you don't get that legendary every month. All right, so we'll go over the balance changes, but before that, one other thing they changed was the new I don't really know what to call it. New refund system. So if you owned a card and they made balance changes to it, or I believe they specifically call out nerfs, if they made what they refer to as a nerf to that card, you would get refunded the difference of the casting cost and the what's that called? The sharding cost, I guess is what I'll call it. So when you were to get your gems for a card, just turn it into gems, and the difference of that between what it costs to craft it, you'll now be refunded those gems if a card gets nerfed and it is in your collection. I've seen some people get some absurd amounts of gems on it. There's a guy on the Legends Reddit who got, I think it was like 12k worth of gems because a bunch of his cards he had were premiums. So yeah, what was nice about this was that they announced it like super early. So if you were quicker to the trigger, like I did, I crafted 2 Genius Path Mages, which we'll get to. It was one of the cards that was nerfed, and effectively, I was only spending 400 gems to craft each of those cards. Worked out pretty nicely for me, and I'm kind of happy about it. Alright, so we'll quickly now go into the nerfs. So the big nerf that everyone was begging for and everyone wanted, Tullius's conscription. This was a rather tame nerf. There was a lot they could have done to this card, but I'm kind of in agreement. The first sentence pretty much sums it. We don't dislike what Tullius conscription is doing. Yeah, Tullius conscription is kind of supposed to be a finishing card. It's supposed to be big. It's supposed to be expensive. It limits your deck building strategies and how you can build up your deck. Like Tullius conscription is a hard card to play in a 50 card deck. You almost have to play a 75 card deck and then stack 20 to 25 2-drops into it. It limits how you can design your deck. The problem is the card is really efficient. I don't know if anyone knew this. It's a really good card. I think a lot of the issues around the community's kind of hate for it is I think a lot of decks can beat it and just people don't play as they really should against it. Or that the deck, because it's running 25 2 drops, you can. The conscription deck can get an advantage in the early game, and the mid range deck doesn't get rolling fast enough to beat out when the Tellius conscription comes down on turn 11. So I do think this is a good change, though. Because, like I said, this gives the mid-range decks, the control decks, able to turn and try to beat down the conscription deck before they get to their conscription. I do still kind of think the best way to beat conscription would be to have more cards that better combat conscription. More cards that attack the mana cost, more cards that are discard effects that get rid of expensive cards people get in their hands. When you're playing against Telvanni conscription, you know when they tutor to conscription. If there was a card that was able to attack that conscription and just rip it right out of their hand, that would be a pretty good card that you'd see played a good bit. But overall, this is a good change. I would not be surprised if later on this goes up again to 13, because this is, in my mind, such a tame change. I am glad, though, they didn't make it unique. That was a big talk, that this card could be made a unique. My opinion on that is that's actually a really bad change, because that limits the ability to play this card to pretty much exclusively Telvanni, because Telvanni has all of the tutor cards to find conscription. It has Lineth and it has Sun and Shadow. Those are effectively two copies of conscription. So it doesn't attack the big the big bad deck that runs conscription. So good change. I wouldn't be surprised if this gets nerfed again in the future. Alright, moving on to the next card, Genius Pathmage. This is probably the second most significant change that was made. In my opinion, the best deck in the game is still Nixox Telvanni, and it's been that way for quite a long time. The reason why you don't see that deck that much is because that deck is mentally draining to play. That is the single most hardest deck to play in this game. And it's hard to sit down for 2 hours and play that deck. I don't like playing that deck, so I don't play that deck. I also don't like Genius Pathmage, but we'll talk about some other time. But this change completely changes how you play that deck. That deck has to be completely redesigned. Genius Pathmage is a card in its own little box. It seems like a pretty good card. You play it, you get a card that you can just cast this turn, and you get a card put into play. It's reasonable on its own. The problem with this card comes when it starts pulling out Nixoxes, Doppelgangers, Sun and Shadow, and this card just staggers. And then you start casting oh shoot, I forget the name of the card, and now I have to look it up, and I feel really bad about this because I completely forgot the name of it. Ulfric's Uprising. You combine it with Ulfric's Uprising, and you get more cards. Like, this card can explode when put in a situation with cards that it enables. So, moving this up to 7 really changes how Nixox Telvanni plays. Now, outside Nixox Telvanni, this was kind of just a value card a lot of decks played. So I know some people would play it in like Altar Assassin or Altar Telvanni. Now I'm pretty sure you just go back to playing Conjuration Tutor, which I'm going to be honest, I think was probably better anyway. This really hurts decks that weren't Nixox that weren't Nixox Telvanni. It's just, I don't know what you play now in this spot. I don't know how much more effective this is anymore. This could very well be a card that just kind of falls off the planet, unless somebody redevelops Nixox Telvanni and can pilot that deck the same manner that the previous Nixox Telvanni list played. It's pretty clear to me that this was a nerf meant to just straight up hammer Nixox Telvanni, which it really does. It really, really does. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say on this card. I don't really ever play this. this card. I don't like decks that play it, and I don't like playing it myself. So we'll move on to the big change, Goblin Skulk. This was, woof, woof. Man, did the Reddit explode when they found out this got nerfed. But I'm going to be honest. I don't think this is that big a nerf. The problem with Goblin Skulk was when if you had the ring and you played it on turn 1 and your opponent didn't have an answer. The tempo from that was just absurd. Like, I think I've played about 4 games where I played a Goblin Skulk on turn 1 and my opponent instantly conceded because they didn't have an answer. And it wasn't worth their time to play a game where they were going to be that far behind. And I've played my own fair share of games where my opponent played this turn 1, I had no answer, I spent turn after turn after turn playing cards into it in hopes of stopping it, and just didn't. And that was back when people were just playing Curse. Now everyone's playing Cruel Firebloom. So I do think this card needed to change. It was too explosive in the early game, and too many decks just didn't have an... If you didn't have an instant answer to it, you could very well just lose the game instantly. So they buffed it up. They didn't buff it. They nerfed it by pumping it up to a 3-cost card. In return, because I'm going to be honest, a 3-cost Goblin Skulk would have been terrible, they moved it up to 3 toughness. This is actually pretty big. This means that this card survives nearly everything. A lot of the cards that people used to play to answer Goblin Skulk no longer instantly answer it. You can't Firebolt it. You can still Sorcerer's Negation it, but it's still alive. It loses the Pilfer effect, so people will probably still do that, but it survives. All of the 2 toughness, all the 2/2 guards that people played, Mortal Gatekeeper, Barrow Stalker, they no longer instantly kill a Goblin Skulk. So you got a lot more survivability in this card. So what does that mean? What is that going to change with this card? I think what got hit the most from this is decks that are trying to get a very early aggro and tempo play. So decks like Aggro Halalu, decks like maybe some of the Archer decks, Assassin, particularly that like Burn Assassin and Aggro Assassin and Midrange Assassin. Those decks probably get hit pretty hard by this because it takes away an aggressive 2-drop option from those decks. Whereas before you had Mournhold Trader and Goblin Skulk, and you could have both those together, and either one of those was just such a great tempo play on turn 1, turn 2. And now you have to wait an extra turn. Now you have to do this on turn 2, turn 3. It slows down your deck. So this will hurt mostly the aggressive decks. What this doesn't really hurt is kind of the longer range, mid-range, and control decks. So a deck like Altar Assassin, which I play a lot, that doesn't really change that much. You can still play this. You can still get it out and Cruel Firebloom people to death, because you're not playing that aggro game. You just want to have Goblin Skull hitting people so you can get cards that are value. In this case, Cruel Firebloom, which kills everything in the game. So decks like that I don't think are significantly impacted by this change. But the aggro decks on the other side are hammered pretty hard by this. I think Aggro Halalu will survive. I think the Aggro Assassin, Burn Assassin really got hit hard by this. I think that's probably about it. So that's my thought. I think a lot of the hate on this change is overblown. I think a lot of the people that hate the change have just kind of blown out people too often with this card. Alright, so I'll move on to the next one, Ash Berserker. This one kind of surprised me a little bit because I don't think Ash Berserker... I think a better change of Ash Berserker would have been to move it to 2 toughness, because that means it dies to like everything. And you're playing on turn 4 just to get 1 card most often. But, so the change they made it from a 4-3 to a 3-3. The main reason, I mean, you can read it right up to the point. Ash Berserker is currently too easy to self-activate. It's that simple. This card as a 4/3 was really easy to flip. So a lot of the decks that kind of abuse their ability to quickly make this itself a 5 power creature, those got hit the most. So what are those decks? What decks were trying to self-activate this? Pretty much all of the. If you were running a red heavy deck with Ash Berserker, this doesn't really impact you that much. Most of the red decks don't play anything that is just only +1 power. It's all +2 power. You're playing Scimitars, you're playing Mortal Gatekeepers. You can turn this into 5 power really easy with just red. What really got hit was the yellow decks. So your Crusaders, your Veterans, those got hit pretty hard because they were able to really easily turn this card around into 5 power with 5th Legion Trainers, Divine Fervors, Praetorian Commander. Those 3 particular cards were really easy to make this into 5 power. So one deck I ran a lot, I ran Rhetoric Conscription a lot. This card's great in that list because you run a full set of 5th Legion Trainers, you run a full set of Divine Fervors, you run a full set of Praetorian Commanders. This card was a no-brainer to play in that list because it was so easy to get the 5 power. But now that this is a 3 power, you now need 2 of those to get this up to 5 power. I don't think I can play this card in Rhetoric Conscription anymore. It's just not good enough. I'll have to go back and review and figure out what I can replace this with, because this is straight up not playable in that deck anymore, because it's impossible to get to 5 power, and that deck doesn't run creatures with 5 power. But a lot of the other lists, like I said, most of them are just easily turned on by some other creature, or were easy to flip this around. So your battle mage, your mid-range battle mage list, that deck had so many 5 power creatures that it really didn't matter about turning around Ash Berserker. Your aggro warrior, now Orc Warrior might get hit a little bit. Orc doesn't run a lot of really good ways to buff this up or get something up to 5 power. It's kind of just more like Smork your face. You kind of have to combo your way to get up to 5 power with Orc and then play this card. So that got hit a little bit. But Aggro Warrior runs Siege Catapult. And the thing about Siege Catapult is you never can test the Siege Catapult. You can test everything around it. So this doesn't really get harmed in Aggro Warrior. So what really got hit was the yellow decks that were playing Ash Berserker and maybe Orc. So I don't think this is a really significant change, but those yellow decks got hit pretty hard. Outside that, I mean, you can still turn this card on. Okay. So that's all of the nerfs. So let's talk about some of the buffs. And by some of the buffs, I mean they buffed all the they buffed a bunch of Exalt creatures. So Temple Patriarch went from 7 cost to 6 cost. I don't think highly of this card. Sorry guys. I don't run. I've never really played around with Exalt decks. I think they're kind of silly. I think Exalt has never been a really. There's really only one good Exalt card, and that is Archcannon, the Archcannon. There's no other really good Exalt cards to play. So I don't think this changes much, but we'll move on to the next card, Anora's Keeper. So I've had thoughts on this card for a while. A 3-drop 4/3 is good. Just pure stat line, that's pretty good. To have this alternate ability to exalt it and get a Heirloom Greatsword, that's okay. It's not great, but it's not okay. I mean, it's not terrible. The main problem is that Heirloom Greatsword is a bad card. That's the main issue here. It's not that Anora's Keeper is a bad card, it's that Heirloom Greatsword is a bad card. Heirloom Greatsword costs 6 to play. It costs 6. So, like, even if you get this into play for 7 Magicka, as a 9/3. This is pretty easy to answer. Yeah, it can do a lot of damage, but it's pretty easy to answer. And then you get stuck with a 6-cost Heirloom Greatsword in your hand with nothing to do with it. I mean, I'm not too high on that. And along with that, it's trying to figure out where you can play this card. The only deck I'm of the opinion you can play this card in is mid-range / aggro sorcerer, because this is the kind of card that deck thrives on. Just like well-statted cards. It's probably what makes this card kind of reasonable for that is it gives you an alternate way to play the card, so you can always exalt it for 7. That's kind of handy in that deck that doesn't have a lot of great draw power, or kind of give you some extra range as you're nearing the end of the game. Like that deck likes to just play one card, play one threat, and kind of just stampede you out because you have to play multiple cards to deal with. Your opponent has to play multiple cards to deal with your threats. This you can kind of just play as a 4/3 and it's fine, unless they have something with 3 power that can equally trade with it. Or you can exalt it in the shadow lane and threaten big time damage. That's really the only way I know to play this card. Like even in arena, this card's not that great because it's legendary. There's going to be better legendaries to choose from. So I don't think there's changed much on this card either. Mostly because Heirloom Greatsword is not a good card. Now this, on the other hand, is worth talking about. Temple Conjurer. Temple Conjurer is a card I've had a lot of good success with in arena. This is actually a pretty good arena card, as it was before. That's before it got this change to now it's Exalt 3. The important thing to remember is that if you're reading this card, this is actually a 5-cost card. It is not a 2-cost card. It is a 5-cost card that throws 2 bodies into play, giving you a total of 7 power. Like 5 magicka for 7 power. That's all you need to know. This is a good card. It was a decent card before. Now it's just a straight up good card. Play this card. It's really good now. It's probably ridiculous in arena now. So that's pretty much it for all of the changes they made. I believe the new monthly card was spoiled, but I'll probably make a second video on that some other day and just stick to this with the review for the new 2.5 patch. So hope everyone enjoyed it. Peace out.